A 5-year-old girl in a nurse costume ran through an Arlington parking garage with her violent father's footsteps thundering behind her. And when she stumbled past Conrad Reaper Walsh, a Hells Angels member haunted by the daughter he'd failed to save 15 years ago, he made a split-second choice that would force him into a 14-month war he wasn't sure he was ready for. He knelt down, looked her in the terrified eyes, and whispered 6 words that would redefine family, brotherhood, and redemption. Was history going to repeat itself? Before we dive into this story, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this message of redemption, protection, reaches across America. My wife thinks I'm wasting my time as I come here to give you all these stories. Are we going to let her keep saying that? Let's prove her wrong. Hit that subscribe button. You're about to join a community that stands for brotherhood and justice and proving. Now, let's get into the story. Conrad Reaper Walsh had learned 3 truths in 42 years of living hard and dying slow. Marines don't leave people behind. Leather and chrome heal wounds that words can't touch. And some men don't deserve the children they're given. The 3rd truth was why he sat on his Harley in the Arlington Town Center parking garage on a Tuesday afternoon in October, watching a little girl in a nurse costume run for her life while her father's voice echoed off concrete like thunder promising lightning. He'd earned his road name Reaper in Fallujah, not because he killed well, though he had, but because he'd carried 11 wounded Marines out of an ambush that should have killed them all, death following his footsteps and never quite catching up. 20 years later, that same refusal to let death claim people in front of him was why he didn't start his engine and ride away when Elizabeth stumbled past his bike with tears streaming and a stuffed bunny clutched like the only friend she had left in the world. She looked up at him with eyes that recognized monsters and was desperately hoping he wasn't one. 5 years old, blonde pigtails, bruise on her left forearm in the shape of adult fingers. Conrad had seen that bruise before, 15 years ago on his daughter Emma, and he'd been deployed in Afghanistan when the call came that Emma's stepfather had finally gone too far during discipline, and there'd be no more bruises because there'd be no more Emma. He'd come home to a closed casket and a guilt that rode passenger on every mile he'd ridden since. So when Joe Travis rounded the corner, 6'2", business suit wrinkled with rage, face red from bourbon and entitlement, fists already clenched, Conrad swung his leg off the bike, knelt to Elizabeth's eye level with the kind of calm that came from leading men through hell, and made a promise his soul had been waiting 15 years to keep. "You're in danger. Pretend I'm your dad. Can you do that?" Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak, and Conrad stood between her and the man who'd put that bruise on her arm. His tattooed arms crossed over the Hells Angels' death head on his cut, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced worse men than Joe Travis and walked away standing. "She stays with me until her mother gets here, and if you take one step closer, you're going to learn why they call me Reaper." Joe stopped, not because he was smart, but because something in Conrad's eyes promised that whatever Joe thought he could do to his daughter, Conrad would return tenfold, and courts wouldn't be involved. "That's my fucking daughter," Joe snarled, trying to sound dangerous despite the way his hands shook with adrenaline and cheap liquor. "You got no right. I've got every right a human being has to stop a grown man from chasing a terrified 5-year-old through a parking garage." Conrad's voice stayed level, lethal. "Now you're going to back up, sober up, and wait for her mother. or we're going to have a conversation about those finger-shaped bruises on that little girl's arm." A silver Honda Civic screeched to a stop 20 feet away, and a woman in her late 20s burst out, blonde hair pulled back, barista apron still on, face cycling through relief and terror when she saw Elizabeth pressed against Conrad's leg. "Oh my God, Lizzie!" Sarah ran forward, scooped Elizabeth into her arms, and turned to Conrad with gratitude that looked like drowning. Thank you. I was in the bathroom for 2 minutes and he—" "You can't keep her from me," Joe advanced, emboldened by his ex-wife's presence, legal entitlement overriding survival instinct. "I have custody rights. The judge said—" "The judge didn't see what I just saw." Conrad positioned himself between Joe and Sarah, his 6'3" frame and 20 years of Marine Corps combat training making it very clear that Joe's legal rights ended where Conrad's tolerance began. A grown man chasing a crying child. That's not custody. That's predator shit. "Who the fuck are you?" Joe demanded. "Nobody," Conrad said. "Just someone who was in the wrong place at the right time to stop you from doing something you'd regret." Sirens cut through the afternoon as Arlington PD rolled into the garage, called by some concerned citizen who'd seen the confrontation and assumed the tattooed biker was the problem. 2 officers approached with hands near weapons, taking in the scene. Businessman in a suit, crying woman with child, biker in Hell's Angels colors. Their assumptions were written on their faces before anyone spoke. Joe's voice shifted instantly to victim. "Officer, thank God. This man threatened me, kept me from my daughter. I have legal custody." Conrad stayed silent, while Joe lied, watched Sarah's face collapse as she realized how this would play, felt Elizabeth's small hand grip his jeans like he was the only solid thing in a world that had just proven adults couldn't be trusted. The officers checked IDs, ran Conrad's name, found what Conrad knew they'd find: disorderly conduct from bar fight 3 years ago, resisting arrest from a traffic stop that got heated, the kind of record that made judges nervous and lawyers rich. Joe's record came back clean, not because he wasn't violent, but because Sarah had dropped charges twice before out of fear he'd take Elizabeth permanently. The system was broken. Conrad had known that since Emma died, and the courts had given her to a man with restraining orders the system chose not to enforce. He'd joined the Hell's Angels not because he was an outlaw, but because he'd learned that when laws fail children, someone has to stand in the gap. And sometimes that someone wears patches courts don't respect, but children understand mean protection. The senior officer, Martinez, nameplate said, with eyes that had seen enough to be skeptical of first impressions, looked at Sarah. "Ma'am, what happened here?" Sarah's voice shook. "My ex-husband violated the custody agreement. He's not supposed to be near Lizzie without supervision. I was using the restroom and he tried to take her. This man," she gestured at Conrad, "stopped him." Martinez turned to Elizabeth. "Honey, is that true? Were you scared?" Elizabeth nodded into her mother's shoulder, then looked at Conrad and said something that cracked every wall he'd built since Emma died. "He saved me. He said, 'Pretend he's my dad.'" The parking garage went silent. Joe's face went from red to white. The officers exchanged glances. Martinez sighed like he'd seen this script before and hated how it ended. "Mr. Travis, do you have documentation of the custody agreement?" Joe produced paperwork that proved he had joint custody despite Sarah's objections, despite documented incidents, despite everything except what mattered, that Elizabeth was terrified of him. "Sir," Martinez addressed Conrad, "I'm going to need you to step back while we sort this out." Conrad met the officer's eyes and saw a father who understood but had a job to do. He knelt one more time beside Elizabeth and did what Marines do when they promise something important. "Your mom's got you now. You're safe. And if you ever need help again, you call." He handed Sarah a card, plain white, just a phone number, the Hells Angels emergency line. Sarah took it with trembling hands. "Thank you. I don't even know your name." "Conrad." He stood, raised 2 fingers in the biker salute that meant ride safe. "I see you. You're not alone," and walked back to his bike, knowing this wasn't over, knowing Joe wouldn't stop, knowing he'd just made a promise to a little girl who looked like Emma, and that meant he was all in whether the law liked it or not, because when a Marine makes a promise, he keeps it. And when a biker becomes family, even pretend family for 6 words in a parking garage, they're family forever. Sarah called the number 3 hours after the parking garage, after Joe's lawyer sent threatening emails about interfering with parental rights and criminal bikers intimidating a concerned father, after Elizabeth woke up screaming from a nightmare where Daddy found her and Mommy couldn't run fast enough. The phone rang twice before Conrad answered, with the kind of voice that said he'd been waiting. "It's Sarah. From today. I don't know what to do." 20 minutes later, she sat across from him at the Bluebird Diner on Wilson Boulevard, Elizabeth coloring with crayons a waitress had provided, while Sarah explained 3 years of legal hell in a voice that kept breaking and apologizing for breaking. The courts had given Joe joint custody despite documented incidents. The time he'd grabbed Elizabeth's arm hard enough to leave bruises, the time he'd driven drunk with her in the car, the time neighbors called police for screaming that turned out to be just discipline, according to Joe's expensive lawyer. Sarah had filed for restraining orders that judges granted then dismissed when Joe's attorney argued she was using false allegations to alienate the father. She'd moved twice, changed jobs, lived in fear, and the system kept handing her daughter back to the man who'd put her in therapy at age 4. "I tried everything legal," Sarah whispered, staring at coffee she wasn't drinking. "He has a clean record because I dropped charges twice. His lawyer said if I pressed it, he'd take Elizabeth full-time and I'd never see her again. So I stayed quiet." And she kept getting hurt. Conrad listened the way Marines learned to listen in war zones, for what wasn't being said as much as what was. "Why today? Why'd he grab her in public?" "The custody agreement gives him supervised visits at a neutral location. He showed up at the mall, drunk, demanding I hand her over immediately instead of meeting at the arranged spot. I said no. He grabbed her. I ran to find security. Elizabeth ran to escape. And you..." Sarah's voice finally broke completely. "You saved her when everyone else has been telling me to cooperate, to co-parent, to think about what's best for her relationship with her father." "What's best for her," Conrad said quietly, "is not being terrified." He'd heard this story before. Emma's mother had told the same one to judges who decided maintaining paternal relationships mattered more than the terror in a little girl's eyes. The system was designed to reunite families, not protect children from the families that needed to stay broken. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him documentation, photos of bruises, emails from teachers concerned about Elizabeth's behavior, medical records noting injuries Joe explained away as playground accidents. Everything that should have mattered but didn't when Joe's lawyer argued alienation and parental rights and the sanctity of father-daughter bonds. "Here's what's going to happen," Conrad said, making a decision that would either save this child or destroy what was left of his freedom. "You're going to take Elizabeth somewhere safe tonight. Tomorrow I'm calling a meeting with my brothers. We're going to make sure Joe understands that whatever legal rights he has on paper don't mean shit when he's being watched by people who don't operate on court schedules." Sarah's eyes widened. "I can't ask you to." You didn't ask. I offered. There's a difference. Conrad leaned forward. I lost my daughter because I was overseas when she needed someone to stand between her and a man exactly like Joe. Courts gave him custody despite warnings. System failed. She died. I can't bring Emma back, but I can make damn sure Elizabeth doesn't end up another statistic that makes people shake their heads and wonder why nobody did something. Sarah started crying. Not the broken crying of someone giving up, but the desperate crying of someone who'd been drowning and just felt solid ground. Elizabeth looked up from her coloring, saw her mother's tears, and did what broke Conrad's heart for the second time that day. She climbed off her chair, walked to him, and put her small hand on his tattooed forearm. Don't be sad, Mr. Conrad. You're a good pretend daddy. Conrad looked at this 5-year-old who'd decided he was safe despite every stereotype that said men who looked like him were dangerous, and made a promise that would define everything that came next. Not pretend, kiddo. Real. When a biker says he's got you forever. Thursday night church meeting at the Hells Angels Arlington Clubhouse on Columbia Pike brought 23 brothers, ranging from Prospect Jimmy at 22 to Old Man Jackson at 67, united by one truth. Family protected its own, and family wasn't always blood. Conrad stood at the head of the worn oak table that had hosted strategy sessions for charity rides, veteran support operations, and exactly this kind of decision, what to do when the law failed and Brotherhood had to fill the gap. He explained Elizabeth, Sarah, Joe, the parking garage, the custody nightmare, showed the documentation Sarah had provided, told them about Emma. The room stayed silent until Conrad finished with the question that mattered. I'm asking for club support, 24/7 surveillance, safe house coordination, presence that makes Joe think twice. This goes sideways. It's on me. But I need to know my brothers have my back. Brick, the VP, 6'5", former Army Ranger, hands like cinder blocks, spoke first. Boss, you even gotta ask? Kids in danger, system won't help. That's exactly why we exist. I'm in. Hands went up around the table. Every brother, no hesitation. Doc, the club medic and former Navy corpsman, leaned forward. I'll examine Elizabeth, document everything medical. Courts might have ignored previous evidence, but they can't ignore a physician's report showing pattern injuries. Jury, nickname earned from 2 years of paralegal work before he said fuck the system and became a welder, pulled out his laptop. I'll research the custody case, find procedural errors, anything we can use to challenge Joe's access legally before we have to do it. Less legally. Chains, the enforcer who'd earned his road name by pulling a burning helicopter pilot out of a crash in Kandahar using literal chains, cracked his knuckles with the sound of someone looking forward to professional application of violence. And when legal doesn't work? Then we make sure Joe Travis understands that some fathers don't deserve the title, Conrad said. But we do this smart. Formation surveillance, rotations that don't look obvious, presence without provocation. We're not vigilantes. We're concerned citizens exercising our constitutional right to exist in public spaces where children happen to be. Preacher, the club chaplain and former Green Beret who'd found God somewhere between Ramadi and realizing he'd killed 17 men and needed to believe in redemption, added what everyone was thinking. Conrad, you know this might not end clean. Joe's got rights on paper. We interfere too much. Courts could come after us for harassment, kidnapping, a dozen charges his lawyer will invent. I know, Conrad said, and I'm doing it anyway. Because 15 years ago I followed orders, stayed deployed, trusted the system to protect my daughter. She's dead. This time I'm choosing the kid over the law. The vote was unanimous. 23 brothers saying yes, not because it was legal, but because it was right. As the meeting broke up and brothers divided assignments, Brick would coordinate surveillance, Doc would handle medical documentation, Jury would research legal angles. Conrad felt something he hadn't felt since Emma died. Purpose beyond revenge, protection beyond regret. Old Man Jackson, who'd been riding since Vietnam and had seen enough broken systems to fill a graveyard, gripped Conrad's shoulder on the way out. You're doing what every father should do, standing between evil and innocence. That little girl asked you to pretend. You're about to make it real. Conrad looked at the memorial wall where Emma's photo hung beside 20 other lost brothers, children, friends, the club remembered. I should have made it real for Emma. You were at war for your country, Jackson said. Now you're at war for this kid. That's not replacement, Conrad. That's honoring your daughter by making sure another father's failure doesn't kill another little girl. As brothers mounted bikes and rumbled into the Arlington night to begin surveillance rotations, Conrad sent Sarah a text. We're watching. She's safe. Sleep tonight. 3 minutes later, Sarah responded with a photo, Elizabeth asleep, finally, clutching the stuffed bunny, a small smile on her face for the first time in months. Underneath, thank you for being the dad she needed today. Conrad stared at that message and realized he'd been given something impossible, a second chance to save a daughter. Not his daughter. But maybe that was the point. Maybe fatherhood wasn't about biology. Maybe it was about showing up when monsters came calling and refusing to walk away even when the law said you should. Joe Travis discovered his ex-wife had criminal biker protection when he showed up unannounced at Sarah's apartment on South Glebe Road at 11 p.m. Friday night, drunk enough to think forcing his way in was reasonable, sober enough to recognize the 2 Harleys parked in guest spaces that hadn't been there during his previous stalking visits. Brick and Chains sat on their bikes, not blocking anything, not threatening anyone, just existing in a public parking lot with the kind of presence that suggested Joe's next decision would be his most important. Joe, emboldened by bourbon and a lawyer who'd convinced him he was the victim, approached anyway. You can't intimidate me. I have every right to see my daughter. You have supervised visitation rights at neutral locations per the custody agreement, Brick said, voice even, not moving from his bike. This is neither supervised nor neutral, so you're gonna turn around, sleep it off, and see your lawyer Monday about proper channels. Fuck your proper channels! Joe's voice echoed across the parking lot, waking neighbors who'd learned to ignore Sarah's ex-husband's late-night harassment, but definitely noticed bikers. That's my daughter up there with my ex-wife who's turning her against me with lies. Chains dismounted slowly. 6'4", a former Marine Scout sniper who'd learned patience was how you survived, but sometimes survival required making threats clear. Mr. Travis, you're drunk, it's 11 at night, and you're violating the agreement by being here. We're not stopping you from leaving. We're just making sure you don't do something stupid that ends with cops, courts, and consequences. Joe pulled out his phone, fingers fumbling, face red. I'm calling the police, reporting harassment, intimidation. Go ahead, Brick said. When they arrive, we'll explain we're friends of Ms. Sarah's who happen to be visiting. You'll explain why you're drunk at your ex-wife's apartment at 11 p.m., demanding entry. Let's see who the cops believe. Joe hesitated, some sober part of his brain recognizing he was about to lose this confrontation badly. Instead of calling police, he did something worse. He called his lawyer. Gregory Marsh answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep and annoyance. Joe, it's almost midnight. They've got bikers protecting her, Hell's Angels, intimidating me, keeping me from my daughter. Marsh, who'd made millions defending assholes from consequences, woke up fast. This was leverage. This was ammunition. This was exactly the kind of escalation he could use to paint Sarah as unfit and Conrad as dangerous. Don't engage. Leave immediately. Document everything. I'll file emergency motions Monday morning for full custody on grounds Sarah is exposing Elizabeth to criminal elements. Joe hung up, looked at Brick and Chains with the smile of someone who thought he'd just won, and delivered his parting shot. You just cost Sarah her daughter. My lawyer's going to have Elizabeth in my custody permanently by next week. Judges don't like mothers who bring biker gangs around children. He walked, stumbled, back to his BMW and drove away, too drunk to care about DUIs, too entitled to fear consequences. Brick and Chains watched him go, then called Conrad with news that confirmed what they'd all known. Protecting Elizabeth meant fighting a system designed to favor biological parents, even when those parents were monsters. Conrad listened from his apartment in Ballston, where he'd been researching custody law until his eyes burned, trying to find legal angles jury might have missed. He's going to use us against Sarah. Yeah, Brick confirmed. Question is, do we back off and let the courts fail Elizabeth, or do we stay and fight knowing we might make it worse? Conrad thought about Emma, about the judge who'd granted custody to her stepfather, despite warnings because maintaining family relationships mattered more than a child's fear. About the call from Afghanistan that came too late. About Emma's funeral, where he'd promised her grave he'd never let it happen again. We stay, and we document everything. Every time Joe shows up drunk, every threat, every violation. Courts want to use us as evidence Sarah's unfit. We'll show them evidence Joe's dangerous. Let them decide if bikers protecting a child is worse than a drunk father hunting her. Monday morning, Marsh filed his emergency motion. Respondent Sarah Travis has engaged members of a known criminal motorcycle organization, Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club, to intimidate petitioner Joe Travis and deny him court-ordered access to his minor child Elizabeth Travis. This exposure to criminal elements creates an unsafe environment, rendering respondent unfit for primary custody. The motion requested immediate transfer of Elizabeth to Joe's custody, pending full hearing. It was scheduled for Thursday, 3 days away, when Sarah called Conrad sobbing, saying she'd just been served papers that could take Elizabeth permanently. Conrad made a decision that would either save this child or destroy his freedom. We need evidence that makes Joe look worse than us. And we've got 72 hours to get it. The thing about men like Joe Travis was they couldn't help themselves. Give them enough rope, enough alcohol, enough entitlement, and they'd hang themselves if you just watched carefully enough. Brick coordinated surveillance rotations with the precision of someone who'd run reconnaissance missions in Kandahar, and what the Hells Angels documented over the next 72 hours was a masterclass in self-destruction. Tuesday, 3 p.m. Joe left his law firm office in Rosslyn, drove to Clarendon Bar, drank 4 bourbons in 90 minutes. Wrench followed him out, filmed him stumbling to his car, getting behind the wheel. Called Arlington PD with anonymous tip about suspected DUI. Joe was pulled over, blew 12 over the legal limit, and was arrested. Tuesday, 11 p.m. Joe posted bail, went directly to Sarah's apartment, banged on her door, screaming threats about taking Elizabeth, about making Sarah pay, about showing everyone what a lying bitch she was. Doc filmed everything from the parking lot, audio clear enough to use in court. Wednesday morning, Marsh filed motion to dismiss the DUI, arguing his client was under extreme emotional distress due to being denied access to his daughter by criminal elements. The motion included photos of Hells Angels bikes outside Sarah's apartment as evidence of ongoing intimidation. Wednesday afternoon. Conrad met with Sarah and Jury at a Starbucks in Ballston to review options. Jury had found something interesting, a pattern of dismissed charges in Joe's past, including a domestic violence complaint from an ex-girlfriend 7 years ago that disappeared when Joe's firm made a generous donation to a judicial campaign. "He's connected," Jury explained. "His firm handles municipal contracts. Judges know him. That's why Sarah keeps losing." "So the system's rigged," Sarah said, voice hollow. "What's the point of evidence if judges are already bought?" "The point," Conrad said, "is that judges care about optics. Right now, Marsh is framing this as bad mother exposes child to criminals. We flip it. Concerned citizen with military background protects child from abusive father while mother seeks legal remedy. We're not vigilantes. We're Americans exercising our right to protect vulnerable citizens when the system is slow." "How?" Sarah asked. "By making Joe do something so public, so undeniable, that even bought judges can't ignore it." Thursday morning, 90 minutes before the custody hearing, Conrad did something that would either be brilliant or destroy everything. He brought Elizabeth to the courthouse. Not to testify, she was too young, and Conrad wouldn't traumatize her further, but to be present, visible, a reminder that this wasn't paperwork. This was a child. Sarah had been against it. What if the judge orders her handed to Joe immediately? Then we find out if judges care more about legal precedent or about looking at a terrified 5-year-old and explaining why her fear doesn't matter. They waited in the hallway outside Family Court 4, Elizabeth sitting between Sarah and Conrad, coloring pictures of butterflies with markers Preacher's wife had bought. Joe arrived with Marsh at 9:45, saw Elizabeth, and his face transformed from smug confidence to rage that he wasn't good enough at hiding. He approached, despite Marsh grabbing his arm, despite the bailiff watching, despite every instinct of self-preservation screaming this was a trap. "Lizzie, come here. Daddy wants to talk to you." Elizabeth pressed against Conrad's leg the same way she had in the parking garage, choosing the scary-looking biker over her biological father. Joe's mask slipped completely. "Get over here now!" His voice echoed through the marble hallway. "You don't get to ignore me. I'm your father!" Elizabeth started crying. Sarah pulled her close. Conrad stood, placing himself between Joe and the child, and when Joe grabbed for Elizabeth anyway, Conrad caught his wrist with the grip of someone who'd disarmed insurgents and wasn't impressed by drunk lawyers in suits. "Touch her, and we see how fast that bailiff moves." The bailiff moved fast. So did the other court officers. So did the 3 people filming on phones who'd witnessed a grown man scream at and grab for a crying 5-year-old while her mother tried to protect her. Joe was pulled back, separated, told to wait in the courtroom. Marsh looked like he'd swallowed glass. His entire strategy of painting Sarah as unfit had just been obliterated by his client's public meltdown. Judge Patricia Morrison took the bench at 10 a.m., reviewed the motions, and asked one question that would decide everything. "Counselor Marsh, I've read your allegations about criminal motorcycle involvement. But before we proceed, I'd like to understand, why was your client screaming at his 5-year-old daughter in my hallway 30 minutes ago?" Marsh tried to spin it. Emotional distress, alienation, mother poisoning the relationship. Morrison cut him off. "I watched the security footage. Mr. Travis approached a child who was clearly afraid of him, yelled at her, and attempted to grab her while she cried. Ms. Sarah's friend intervened non-violently. That's not intimidation, that's protection." She looked at Sarah. "Ms. Travis,